Alright, hello again everybody. So today we're going to talk about conflict becomes a crisis. So we're going to talk about the final events that are going to lead up to the Civil War. Our objectives and standards to understand events that led to further division in the United States, and to analyze how the treatment of African Americans caused more conflict. Take a moment there to read the standards if you would please. And our desired result: how did conflicts in the country lead to a crisis? So Kansas and Nebraska. In 1854, Congress passed what is known as the Nebraska Act. And this organized the area of these territories into territories and allowed for that didn't make any sense. So the Kansas and Nebraska. That didn't make any sense either. Okay. So Kansas and Nebraska. In 1854, Congress passed what is known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this organized the area into territories and allowed for popular sovereignty to vote on or determine the slavery issue. Now, this also divided the nation and causes violence between those who are pro-slavery in the territory and also anti-slavery Americans in the territory. So what happens here is we have a lot of conflict, and this man here, John Brown, an abolitionist, will settle in Kansas, and we'll talk more about him later on in the lesson. But this area becomes known as a violent battleground, which becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, because of all the violence between anti-slavery people and pro-slavery people. So a decision of the Supreme Court. In 1857, the Dred Scott case came before the U.S. Supreme Court. So let's kind of talk about this. This man's picture here you see is Dred Scott. He was an enslaved man who traveled with his owner to Illinois and Wisconsin territory where slavery was outlawed. So he's traveling from a slave state, or slave territory, slave state basically, to Illinois and Wisconsin territory where slavery was outlawed. Now, when they returned to Missouri, Dred Scott sued for his freedom. He said, hey, I was living on free territory. I'm technically a free man. So this becomes a case, and it goes before the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, although the Supreme Court was deeply divided, the Supreme Court ruled that Scott could not sue because he was not a citizen of the United States. He is considered property. So even though he's a human being, he is considered property of the owner, so he cannot sue. Now, the Supreme Court also declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. So remember what we talked about last lesson with the Missouri Compromise, with Missouri being admitted as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and they established that line where anything below that line could be slave, anything above it could not. Well, what the Supreme Court says is, you can't tell people when they own something, which is their property rights, even if it's a slave, even if it's property rights, you can't tell them they can't take that property into an area and now they're not part of their property anymore. Okay, a little confusing, but so basically you're telling, people that you can't tell people they can't take their property into another area where they might be deemed free and tell them that they're free people. So many people, including abolitionists, felt the Supreme Court really kind of decided on the side of slavery, and this is going to further divide the country even more. So John Brown leads a raid. Remember we talked about John Brown a couple of slides ago. So in 1859, John Brown believes that the only way to stop slavery was with violence. So he comes up with a plan to attack a federal arsenal. Remember, a federal arsenal is where they keep gunpowder, weapons, things like that. A lot of the weapons and a lot of storage for the weapons. So what they do is they say they're going to capture this federal arsenal, capture the guns, and then arm these slaves in a revolt. Now, Harriet Tubman, one of the big supporters and organizers of the Underground Railroad, supported his plan, but others kind of say, it's not a good idea. So on October 16th, 1859, John Brown and 21 of his followers, of his men, set out for Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Now, they did break into the arsenal. They were successful at that, but few slaves joined the revolt. So John Brown and others felt that slaves would join the revolt and helped, spread their movement, but Brown and his men will be trapped and captured the next day, and John Brown will be convicted for treason and hung. Now, many Northerners are going to view John Brown as a hero who was standing up against slavery and standing up to, slave owners and things like that. So, but either way, this is just another event that leads to the problems of going into the Civil War. So a nation splits apart. So we can see that during the 1850s, there are a lot of unpopular court decisions, laws, and compromises that further divide the nation between Northerners and Southerners, people who supported slavery, people who were against, in favor of slavery, and many political, economic, and ideological views would split the country even further. Now, in the 1840s, anti-slavery political parties tried to come about to bring about change, but they had very little success. In 1854, the Republican Party will be founded in time for the upcoming election. Joining the Republican Party in 1856, you probably know this man's name, Abraham Lincoln, right there. Even though he doesn't have a beard, this is a younger picture of him. He addressed the Illinois Republican Convention in 1858 and made the famous statement that a house divided against itself cannot stand, saying that the country needs to address the issue of slavery and talk about it, because if we become a divided country, well, our country could fall apart and who knows what would happen. In 1860, Lincoln will be chosen by Republicans to run for president, and in the election of that year, there was a division between Democrats in the North and in the South. So this division between Northern Democrats, who maybe didn't want to get rid of, who wanted to get rid of slavery, and Southern Democrats, who did not want to get rid of slavery, this allows for Lincoln to kind of squeeze out some votes and win the election. So Southern states secede. Many Southerners are furious at the election of Abraham Lincoln. They believed he's going to end slavery, he's going to end their whole way of life, the agriculture, things like that. So 7 states decided to secede or leave the United States to form their own country. They were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Okay? And what these 7 states do is they then form their own country, their own government, and they called themselves the Confederate States of America in December 1861. Now, Lincoln's not happy about this. A lot of other people aren't happy about this, but we're not at the war part yet. We're going to see next week when we talk about the Civil War, how the the Civil War breaks out and how that plays out, and we'll talk about that next week. All right? This is a picture here from a scene in front of the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, on the day the Ordinance of Secession was passed. So these are all these people gathered outside of the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, to celebrate or talk about the decision to leave the United States. All right, so our closure. How did conflicts in the country lead to a crisis? Think about Kansas and Nebraska. Think about the Dred Scott decision, the election of Abraham Lincoln. How did all these things move the country closer to a crisis? All right. Hope you have a great rest of your day or night. Talk to you soon. And let me know if you have any questions.